Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Achieving both GDPR Compliance and a Positive Customer Experience. I'm Tracy Quant, and I'll be your moderator. I work on the marketing team here at iOvation. I have a couple housekeeping items to cover quickly before we get started. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand after the live session. We will be sending out the links and documentation after the webinar. You'll be able to access it on our website as well. We want you to get the most from today's presentation, so please ask questions. We'll be answering them at the end of the session, so please feel free to send those along using the Questions tab on the right of your screen. Again, welcome to today's session, Achieving both GDPR Compliance and Positive Customer Experience. Our presenters today are Angie White, Product Marketing Manager, and Mark Weston, our Data Protection Officer. Now we'll pass it off to Angie, but I'll be back at the end to take questions. Over to you, Angie.
Thank you, Tracy. So I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you guys about GDPR. This is something that, I feel very passionately about, and I know my colleague, Mark, feels very passionately about too. All right, so we've got a lot to cover today, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in here. So first off, I want to say that it's not going to be one of those presentations where we do a lot of fear-mongering around possible fines and penalties. Really what we're more interested in is what's the opportunity with GDPR? And, I feel like this is a really interesting time in the market because, the way I see it, there's really an inflection point happening right now where IAM, InfoSec, customer experience can all align around the customer experience. So I think a lot of times, those departments have had competing priorities. Adding more security a lot of times adds more customer friction, which, of course, the customer experience people don't like. So this gives us an opportunity to improve both security and customer experience. And I know that a lot of people, we don't like new regulations. We don't like being mandated to do new things, but I think that can be a good thing a lot of times because it creates a catalyst for change. It creates a catalyst within an organization so that, IAM and InfoSec leaders can have a green light to invest in technologies that are going to help with GDPR compliance. And as I said before, I think this really creates an opportunity for market differentiation. We're seeing more and more that usability and customer experience are key in the marketplace to creating those, those market differentiation, where features and benefits can easily be copied. Customer experience is much harder to copy. Along with the good comes a little bad. So, depending on, response to the GDPR, this is something that could also create, customer friction. So while there's opportunity to be had, there's also definitely some threats here. So walk through our agenda real quick. Today we're going to go through GDPR, some good to knows, talk about what is the opportunity that's presented here, go through a deep dive on how we can balance security and customer experience, and then we'll try to leave some time at the end for some Q&A. So Mark, would you mind just giving a quick overview of the GDPR for everybody?
Yes, absolutely. The GDPR, what is it? There are actually 99 articles in the GDPR. So 60 seconds doesn't feel like a long time, but I'll do my very, very best. So GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, is a pan-European piece of regulatory legislation that replaces the current data privacy law in the EU. It will come into force on the 25th of May this year, which, if I'm correct in my mathematics and my calculations, is 9 weeks on Friday. Save for one or two derogations, it will impose the same regulatory framework from Ireland in the west to Romania in the east, from Sweden in the north to Malta in the south. It covers 500 million people in the wealthiest single market on earth. It ensures the protection of natural persons with regards to the processing of personal data and rules relating to the free movement of personal data. It gives individuals enhanced fundamental rights, protects the freedoms of individuals, and in particular, their right to the protection of their personal data. The aim is one that that protects data but also enables business, and it helps to deliver the digital single market by giving those businesses certainty. One continent, one harmonized set of rules for everyone who's processing data across the European Union.
Great. So another question we get a lot is, who is impacted by the GDPR? Is it just companies inside the EU, or does it also affect companies outside the EU?
I'm glad you asked me that. Basically, GDPR affects individuals like you and me. It's there to protect us as service users, as customers, as consumers, and also as citizens. Essentially, a data subject is an individual about whom processing takes place, and it protects their right to privacy. Processing consists of anything that information technology does with that data, anything that makes the wheels and cogs and levers and pulleys turn within a modern 21st century computer. And additionally, where data is at rest, doing absolutely nothing, again, is considered to be a processing activity. So anything within a computer system that makes the ones and zeros whir is essentially covered by GDPR. And it doesn't specifically just relate to EU citizens. It relates to anyone living in Europe, whether they're born and bred in the EU or whether they are visitors either on vacation, on holiday, working in Europe. They will also be in scope. Additionally, it covers those individuals who have their data processed in the EU. At the moment, I'm sat on the west coast of the United Kingdom, and my colleague Angie sat on the west coast of the United States. Were she to book a flight with BA, British Airways, her data was processed in the European Union, she would be covered by GDPR, even though Angie is physically within the United States. Her data will be in scope of GDPR. Additionally, anyone who buys goods and services, or anyone, should I say, anyone who sells goods and services in the European Union or to European Union citizens or individuals, irrespective of whether that business is based in the EU, will also be in scope for GDPR.
Great, thank you for that. What are some of the operational impacts that businesses should be concerned about?
There are several, but there are 5, I think, that immediately spring to mind. Privacy by design and data minimization is perhaps a key fundamental part of the GDPR that we need to consider. The ideas originated in Canada 30 years ago around the whole concept of privacy by design, but this is a method of designing projects and products to ensure that data privacy is considered at the outset of a project, and also all the key moments of truth in between, from conception or inception of a product right through to delivery and beyond into maintenance. And data minimization means restricting the data to the bare minimum required to achieve the desired ends, essentially restricting that data to that is necessary. Beyond that, there are enhanced requirements around the concept of consent for processing. Consent is a condition of lawful processing, and it's important to understand exactly what consent means. This isn't necessarily just implied consent or taking a cue from someone's actions, but actually looking at whether someone is actually free to say yes, or whether they're having their arm twisted. Take an employment contract. Is consent valid in a situation where there is an unequal financial relationship? And where consent is valid, GDPR also states that it must be capable of being revoked as easy as it has been granted. So it's important to also consider and understand the other conditions of lawful processing, such as processing under a contract, legitimate interest, or whether there's some legal or regulatory duty that falls upon an organisation. And again, also incredibly important under GDPR is the implementation of rules around consent for data relating to minors or children, which is something that needs to be considered even more carefully. GDPR implements similar approaches for data concerning children that are seen under the COPPA legislation in the US. VTech recently fell foul of the copper regulations in the US. Disney, I believe, have come under criticism. There was a case in France with a toy called IQ. Incidentally, my son has. Also, in both France and Germany, there was a toy called My Friend Kayla, and the Germans actually banned that toy because of the absence of parental consent for minors. Beyond that, the importance of data security can't be underestimated. Data security has to be fit for 21st century risks, and there are enhanced breach reporting requirements. Any breach must be notified within 72 hours. That includes notification to both the end user or data subject and to the regulator. So it's really quite important that you know who your data subject is, what data might be affected in the case of a breach, what the risk might be, what mitigation or remediation needs to take place, and also who your go-to regulator of first instance will be. At the moment within the European Union, 28 different countries means 28 different regulators, and if you do business in 28 countries, there's a very good chance that you need to engage with all of those regulators. Under the GDPR, the implementation of the one-stop shop philosophy will mean that many organizations will be able to engage with just the one regulator, although businesses that do carry out certain activities in different countries may well still have more than one regulator, but it's very unlikely that they'll have 28. And those notifications need to take place within 72 hours. So all the different subject matters that I just described need to be considered beforehand. Don't wait until a breach occurs to have to cram everything into 3 days. Which then brings us on to pseudonymization, which is an expression that's been well publicized as being linked to GDPR. And essentially, GDPR categorizes penalties into two tiers. Of the two, GDPR places penalties for security breaches into the lower tier of 10 million euros or 2% of global group turnover. The EU appears to concede that breaches will occur. It's a fact of life in the cyber age, but it's what you do to mitigate that risk that's incredibly important, critical. So when the breach comes, do you lose sensitive confidential information that's held in the clear, or do you lose long indecipherable strings of digits where that data has been pseudonymized either through tokenization or through encryption? The GDPR actually states that breaches involving data where pseudonymization has taken place will not necessarily require notification to the regulator or the data subject where the risk to the subject is low. So where non-notification is permitted, the prospect of a fine being levied becomes diminished. And that brings us on to the consequences of violations. So the two tiers of fines that we probably all know about by now, and I'm sure that everyone present here today is well aware of the impact of those breaches. But there's also the reputational damage, the loss of confidence in your brand, the downtime in dealing with these issues, and the human labor costs, again, can't be discounted.
Thank you, Mark. That lays a really great foundation for our conversation. So I wanted to go ahead and jump straight into privacy by design. This is a concept that I just love, and I think it's something that's so pertinent, especially in the security space. So let's take the example of these two showers. They both have the same core functionality. You can use either one in order to get yourself clean. But I think it's unarguable that the usability and customer experience with one is going to be much higher than with the other. And I feel like in a way this is what we have traditionally done with security. I think a good example of this is passwords. So a lot of times we had services that were moved online and security was an afterthought. So we add username and password and quickly realize that consumers are very bad at usernames and passwords. They use passwords like 1234. They use passwords like password. So then companies try to force a higher level of security onto customers by doing things like having them use a certain number of characters, one capital letter, a special character, a partridge in a pear tree. Okay, I'm just kidding about the last one. But really all this did is it didn't create a more secure environment. It just created a lot more customer friction. They still weren't able to remember passwords. They were having to write them down. They're having to put them in spreadsheets. They're having to reset their passwords all the time. And it's also created a lucrative target for cyber criminals, these big central repositories of logins and usernames. So what's a better way to do this? So let's take a look at multi-factor authentication. What exactly is it and why is it inherently more secure? So as the name implies, it involves multiple factors of authentication, the first being a knowledge factor. This is something you know. So this could be a password, it could be your PIN for ATM, it could be knowledge-based questions. Then you have possession factors. This is something you have. So it could be a token, or like in the last example I gave, your ATM card would actually be a possession factor. So that's a form of two-factor authentication using your ATM card and PIN code. And then the last one is an inherence factor. So this is something you are. So this is a lot of biometrics, your thumbprint, facial recognition, voice recognition. There's even new technologies that have started using the sound of your heartbeat as a type of authentication. So this is really kind of an interesting time because you're seeing a really big explosion in innovation in these two particular areas, in possession factors and inherence factors. And I'll go into that in a little more detail later in the presentation. But one of the questions you want to ask yourself when looking at an MFA solution, you could do this by adding additional layers of security, by doing a homegrown system where you add in thumbprints or things like that. But do you want to have to manage these types of systems separately or as one system? So that's something to consider as, an organization. Another thing to consider is the inherent security of your system. So with traditional systems that use, say, username and password, there have been these big central repositories of credentials that are sitting out in the cloud that are big, attractive, lucrative targets for cyber criminals. A good example of that is the Yahoo breach back in 2013 with 6 billion records compromised. So a much better approach is decentralized out-of-band authentication. So with this, the authentication happens within the user's device, and it's all done through cryptography. It all stays on the device, and all that is sent back to your service is an answer to whether or not that user has been authenticated as that person. And that's a very good thing under GDPR, because now you don't have to worry about having this big central repository of credentials that could be breached and then having to notify all those users, regulators, everybody that Mark listed within 72 hours. All right, so we talked about the security piece of this, but I think the piece that's missing still is the customer. So how can we make this all easier for customers? Well, I think, definitely the answer to that question is through looking at MFA through the lens of the mobile device. So the mobile device is increasingly becoming the center of your customer's world. Depending on your industry, depending on where you're at in the world, we really see that about 70% of transactions are done through a mobile interface. And I would argue that the other 30% a lot of times are augmented by mobile processes. So you might have a customer that starts browsing on their phone and then they go and they finish a purchase using their laptop. But really, with mobile multi-factor authentication, this gives your customer a lot better ease of use. So they can use that to access any channel they interact with you. So they can use it for your online portal, they can use it to call into your call center, they can use it at point of sale, at a kiosk or ATM. So it's really unifying that customer experience so they're not having to remember all these different authentication factors to interact with your service and to purchase your goods. So again, looking at MFA through the lens of the mobile device, again, you start off with the knowledge factor, something you know. This could be a PIN code, it could be a circle code, a lot of flexibility there. Next, you have inherent factors, so thumbprints, facial recognition. And the important thing to really consider with your MFA solution is that it's important to have a flexible solution that's going to be able to adapt as new technologies are adopted in the market, as new innovations come online and consumers want to use those new types of authentication. So a good example of that is Apple moving away from thumbprints towards facial recognition. It's important to be able to be nimble and stay up with what your customers are doing. And then the last factor, possession factor, I alluded to this a little earlier, but there's a lot of new technology in this area too. So possession factors such as Bluetooth, near-field communications. So your customer could use their Apple Watch as a point of authentication. So, the device would compare, they come, and that would be their first factor of authentication, and then they could use, say, their thumbprint as a second factor of authentication. So really easy, really frictionless for the customer. Another thing to consider as you're looking at the types of authentication you want to offer to your customers is customer preferences. Obviously, you don't want to route something that your customers don't like. So we were interested in this as well. So we actually commissioned a report with the IT group where we looked at customer preferences on authentication methods across generations. And, we definitely did see big discrepancies between like how, say, millennials want to authenticate into their accounts versus seniors. And we're going to share this report with everybody in the email that we send out afterwards, so nobody has to try to read this tiny little text. Sorry about that. But so, something else to look for in an MFA solution is something that's flexible. You might look at how you can customize for customers, perhaps let them choose their authentication method. So, if somebody's more comfortable with fingerprint scan, they could choose that, or perhaps a PIN code. The other option with this is having your admin choose the authentication type. So maybe, the admin doesn't feel like, your customers would be open to Bluetooth proximity, so that's something that you could not roll out right away. All right, then the other area that I wanted to touch on was consent for processing. This was something that Mark mentioned in his operational impacts that I think is going to become increasingly important. We're seeing this all over the place. There's mentions of it in the PSD2 mandate, in COPPA that Mark mentioned earlier. And it's really this idea of authorization. So it's kind of a fine line here, the difference between authentication and authorization. With authentication, you're looking to validate that a person is really who they say they are. With authorization, you've validated that yes, they are who they say they are, but now you're validating that they're authorized to do what they're asking to do. So it's kind of a thin line, a thin difference, but it's very important for auditability and being able to show consent with new regulation, with regulations taking a harder stance, especially on parental consent for minors. And on that particular note, Mark, would you mind talking about the age ranges for parental consent under GDPR?
Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, GDPR provides several derogations. Not many, but there are a few, one of which is the way that individual nation states within the 28 members of the EU plus the members of the European Economic Area process data belonging to minors, and the ability of minors to use online services, and in using those online services, the granting of consent. There is a narrow range where these individual countries can actually apply their own restrictions as to which age is permissible to be able, or is deemed able to be able to provide consent, dependent on national sensibilities and other ages of majority within the country. This is anywhere between the ages of 13 and 16. So for children under the age of 13, then consent is or consent from a parent is absolutely mandatory. Whereas when it comes to children, there is there is some degree of flexibility. So anywhere between the age of 13 and 16, certainly in the UK and in Germany, the governments have agreed that that 13 is an applicable age where someone will be able to authorize their own online services. But anyone below the age of 13 will require parental or guardian's consent. There will be some countries in the European Union who may choose stricter laws based on their own national sensibilities and sensitivities around the matter.
Thank you, Mark. So, I think that, does complicate the picture even more. So you have, different countries that have different guidelines for the age of parental consent. And I shouldn't say guidelines, probably mandates for the age of parental consent. So that's why it's more important than ever to have a system where you can automate authorization requests, have that auditability, be able to, frictionlessly get that parental consent if needed. And this is something that you can do with IoT devices, with applications. So this is a really robust feature that I can see a lot of different use cases for. All right, so now I just want to kind of wrap back around to how we balance security and customer experience. So we talked about a number of different things here. I want to hit on, first on the customer experience side, some of the things with mobile MFA that can really help enhance your customer's experience. First, being able to unify the customer experience across all channels, them having one mode of authentication, whether they're at, a point of service cell or at a kiosk or using your online portal. I think that's, something that a lot of us are trying to strive for, is that omni-channel access. User selectable authentication methods. I think this does a number of things. One, it allows users to have a stake in their own security. It allows them to select the type of security or authentication that they're most comfortable with, which in turn decreases friction. And it also helps preserve your brand on a number of levels. One, if you don't have those breaches, there's no loss to reputation, but also, you can utilize this within your own app and preserve your own branding. And then on the security side of things, mobile MFA can be used within your existing services, so it can be layered on top of your existing authentication or used standalone. It's an updatable platform, so that means you don't have to replace every time the new, latest, greatest type of authentication comes into the marketplace. Utilizes advanced cryptography, which is important for pseudonymization requirements. The use of decentralized credentials. Again, we don't want those big central repositories of login credentials that can be breached. And that really reduces your overall attack surface so that you don't have to worry about protecting those types of assets. And then I just wanted to point out to everybody that we have just recently launched a GDPR readiness site. So if you're looking for more information, more assets on some things that you can do to ensure that you're GDPR ready, please check that out. We have a number of assets out there. If you're interested in learning more about multi-factor authentication, we have a great publication, a great ebook that we worked together with the Wiley brand to put together on MFA for Dummies. It's a lot of great information out there. We've got on-demand webinars, blogs, things like that. So if you're interested, feel free to check it out. And with that, I'll go back to Tracy to see if we had any questions.
Thanks, Angie and Mark. That was a great presentation. And thanks to all who submitted questions. As a reminder, you can still submit any questions in the right-hand pane. We do have a couple in. The first one, does your MFA solution also cover the requirements for strong customer authentication under PSD2?
I'll give my
I'll go
2 cents, and then you can give a little more flavor to it.
Okay.
So, so our MFA solution provides, it's completely out of band, so it does qualify as the two factors of authentication that are required under PSD2 for strong customer authentication. You want to give a little more flavor to that, Mark?
Yeah, sure. So, Second Payment Services Directive affects anyone involved in a consumer payment transaction that takes place. You don't need to be based in the European Union. Only you will be in scope if one of the two ends of the transaction take place in the European Union. And essentially, the PSD2 states that organizations involved in payment services need to move away from single-factor authentication towards two or multi-factor authentication models to ensure the security of the transaction. That in itself then has a trigger into GDPR, because obviously those transactions involve personal data, and therefore the more factors you apply to the security infrastructure that sits around those payments, then the more compliant you will be with not just one but two individual regulations.
Great, thanks both. We've got a second question. You mentioned COPA. What is that, and what did VTech do wrong?
Okay, so the COPA regulations are the Children's Online Protection of Privacy Act, and coming from the UK, I love some of the expressions or names that are applied to legislation in the US. I think they're absolutely fantastic. So VTech, essentially, for those who don't know, VTech are a huge international company that deal with or manufacture and retail electronic toys that essentially require the interaction of minors, and essentially what happened is that they were found liable for failures around something called the Kid Connect app and its interaction with something called a Learning Lodge platform. And essentially what happened is it collected personal information of almost 3 million kids, and it didn't provide direct notice to the users, and that also it didn't seek parental or guardian consent on behalf of its users who were below the age of 13. So as a consequence of that, they were fined $650,000, which isn't an insignificant amount of money. Under GDPR, such transgressions will amount to up to 10 million euros, or 2% of global turnover. So I haven't worked out what the global turnover is for VTech, but 10 million euros or something in the region of about $12-13 million, again, is a significant amount of money, and $650,000 is almost something of a drop in the ocean when you can compare it to the 10 million euros or 13 million dollars that would apply to a breach of GDPR for failure to acquire consent and provide sufficient notice to end users.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. We don't have any other questions at this time, so thank you all very much for joining. And go check out our website. As Angie was saying, we have lots of terrific information out there. And this webcast will be recorded and available on demand on our website. We will also email you the link to the webinar and the presentation, as well as the other materials that Angie had mentioned earlier. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day. I'm now ending the webinar.